Kyle. So just a little video to help you with social stratification revision. Stratification is the idea that different groups in society are kind of ordered based on their status, wealth, and power. There's a particular characteristic, so that could be ethnicity, could be class, could be gender, etc., and they're put into this hierarchy, and those at the top have the higher levels of wealth state. So wealth, which is to do with money and investments, power, which is to do with influence, and status, which is to do with prestige and social position. And within a stratification system, it can be based on achieved status, so that's when people earn their position at the top of the hierarchy, or it can be based on ascribed status, so that's when you're born into that position. And in the UK, we have a social class system, so that is obviously based on achieved status, which is an open system, meaning you can move up and down, so you can achieve social mobility. Whereas there are sometimes closed systems of stratification, which means it's based on ascribed status, so you can't change your position. And you would just need to know an example of one stratification system. So you could get like a 3-mark question that would be like, explain one example of a stratification system, and you could talk about the caste system, feudalism, apartheid, slavery, etc. And then you can also state like whether they're open or closed, whether they're based on achieved or ascribed status. Functionalists obviously have a positive view of social stratification. They think it's a fair system. They believe it's based on achieved status, social mobility is possible, and they believe that because our system they perceive our system to be based on meritocracy. So if you work hard, you will achieve the optimum or the best you can for your ability. And Parsons is a sociologist that talks about meritocracy, but Davis and Moore add to this and refer to the idea of role allocation. So this is the idea that stratification is essential. All different jobs in society need to be filled, and they need to be fulfilled by the correct people. So we go through the education system to make sure that we receive the correct training, and those who spend longer in education and spend more money on their training deserve more rewards in the future. So the jobs that are filled by the most hardworking, most talented people are the ones that reap the greatest rewards and have the most significant influence. So if you were to get a question that kind of asks you whether our stratification system is fair or beneficial to all, then your points can be things like achieved status, open society, and social mobility. That could all go together. Then you could do a Parsons paragraph on meritocracy. Then you could do a Davis and Moore paragraph on role allocation. The other side of the argument is that it's not fair. So feminists obviously disagree. They believe that our stratification system is more closed. Men kind of have more ascribed status than women do. And the different points you can make about that are the idea of the glass ceiling. Despite women's hard work, there is a barrier preventing them from achieving promotions. Women have to perform a triple shift, so they still have to perform their housewife and mother duties, as well as having a paid role. And then stereotypes exist, so women are represented in a negative way that doesn't benefit them in the workplace, can lead to sex discrimination. And you can kind of link that to the idea that meritocracy and role allocation aren't as effective as they could be if we lived in an equal society. Also, Marxists, so they believe that we don't have the opportunity to move up the social stratification system in the same way. They agree with this idea that we live in a closed society based on ascribed status. So meritocracy is a myth. Despite a working class person's hard work, they face many barriers that prevent them from being successful. Social mobility is not possible, so the idea that people find it very difficult to move up the social class ladder when you look at kind of statistics in terms of working class children going to university, that kind of thing. The middle class are 8 times more likely to go, showing that social mobility is very difficult. And then also this idea that jobs are based on connections, social capital, cultural capital, economic capital. So it's not based on talent, so therefore role allocation doesn't exist. You also need to know what is meant by socio-economic class, so literally social class. So we have 3 social class groups. So the upper, so ascribed, born into their position, it includes the monarchy and the aristocracy. The middle class are those with jobs that require qualifications, for example, teachers, and then the working class, so usually manual jobs that require more physical skills or more routine work, so things like hairdressers, call centre workers, etc. You need to know what the Registrar General is. So the Registrar General is a kind of measurement of people's social class. So they used to use this up until 1998, and they divided this system here. So at the bottom, you've got the unskilled workers working all the way up to the professional occupations. And they said that this was an objective way of measuring class because it wasn't biased, it wasn't based on someone's opinion, it was using this particular scale based on the requirements of your job in terms of skill level. The problems with having this sort of system is that some of the jobs that are in each category are quite different in terms of the pay. So, for example, surgeons get paid significantly more than solicitors do. Electricians can get paid significantly more than bus drivers, that kind of thing. So there can be quite a disparity of wealth within one position. Also, something like teachers, if you think about the pay difference between a classroom teacher and the head teacher, etc., that would be quite different as well. So this system wasn't particularly useful in distinguishing between pay levels or status levels within a particular category. Also, another problem with it is that women's social class was determined by their husband. So if you were in society now, when so many women work, it's a bit of an outdated system to base it on that. Other people have argued that it's too objective, it should be more subjective, so people should have more of a personal say in where they think they fall within the social class system. More distinctions could be made within the different categories, and some people don't have any position in the hierarchy. So, like students, for example, where do they fall? Or if you don't have a job, where is your position on that? There isn't like a separate category at the bottom for unemployed. So we now use a system called the NSSEC, so the National Statistics Socio-Economic Classification, and it improved this. So now there are more categories essentially. So they've broken up managerial into several more categories. So then we can group people based on similar pay, similar status, and levels of authority. And they've also added additional characteristics and categories. So things like people who are students or unemployed. Then you need to know the different theoretical perspectives on socioeconomic class. So Karl Marx, absolute legend. So he talked about 2 groups in society, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the ruling class, and their position is determined by the fact they own the means of production, and that's an important keyword. So the means of production is anything that you can use to produce something and essentially make profit. So that could be factories, land. In our society now, it would be things like businesses. And the proletariat were basically people who didn't own those things, and they would only make money by working for the bourgeoisie. So the bourgeoisie had to work long hours and only received a small amount of pay. And in order to get the proletariat to continue working for such small pay in return for hard labour, the bourgeoisie had to create a false class consciousness. So this was the idea that they had to believe that this system was fair, or they were benefiting in some way from the system, or they would refuse to work, they would go on strike, they would advocate a communist revolution. So by socialising the proletariat into the norms and values of the bourgeoisie, that's called the ruling class ideology. So by socialising them into the ideas of the ruling class, the bourgeoisie could maintain the false class consciousness and be successful. So things like the myth of meritocracy, things like Bowles and Gintis's idea that through the education system we're socialised into accepting capitalism, that kind of thing. Another thing the proletariat experience is called alienation. So this is the idea that there's very little control over their work. So in terms of production, they receive very little rewards from their work, and because they experienced alienation, that kind of resulted in them becoming quite docile and quite passive. So they were just constantly bored, essentially. So then that meant that they were never sort of critically thinking, they were never in a position to wake up and realise the exploitation they were experiencing and rebel against the bourgeoisie. Some other keywords you need to know: the lumpen proletariat. So they are below the proletariat, they are people that don't work, so unemployed people, including criminals. And he also talked about a group called the petty bourgeoisie. So this was a group below the bourgeoisie, but slightly above the proletariat, and they are kind of the day-to-day managers. So the factory managers, we would call them the middle class today. And Marx believed that over time, polarisation would occur. So the rich would become richer and the poor would become poorer, and this would cause the proletariat to realise that they were being exploited. So if suddenly there was a massive division in terms of how rich some people were and how poor people some were, that would result in the proletariat gaining a class consciousness. Once they would gain that class consciousness, they could create or advocate a communist revolution, and that would result in the means of production being owned communally. So everybody would own the factories, everybody would work in the factories, and they would equally share the profit. And the other concept is this idea of proletarianization. So proletarianization is when companies are being bought over by other companies, and then obviously if you have one boss that's overseeing more and more companies, then you don't need as many people in the petty bourgeoisie. So the more managers there are at the top, the less you need in the middle. And then that would result in people being pushed down into the proletariat. So essentially, when one company becomes like the overseer of others, when they're bought over, you need less CEOs. You only have one CEO of that company. So then everyone else's job gets pushed down a level. So then more and more people become proletariat. So proletarianization is essentially like people being demoted at work. And oligarchs and elite, these are just other key terms that refer to kind of most powerful people in society. So oligarchs is usually associated with very rich people in Russia who have huge amounts of control over lots of different political happenings and have a significant amount of wealth. And then also the idea of the elite, so groups that have huge amounts of power and influence over our society. Criticisms of the Marxist view, so functionalists disagree with this concept. They believe in meritocracy, they believe in social mobility, they believe that the top roles in our society have been allocated based on hard work, talent, rather than inheritance and ascribed status. Feminists obviously see the main conflict in our society as being between men and women rather than the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So they disagree what the kind of main issue of inequality is. Weber. So Weber is like a huge fan of Marx. He just thought that the ideas he put forward were a bit simplistic and needed developing. So Weber kind of added and enhanced, shall we say, what Marx said. So first thing, he did agree with this idea of people's social position being based on their social class, so based on their job, but he also thought that there were other things, so it wasn't just about money, it was also to do with status and power, so it wasn't just about wealth. He believed that there were 4 social class groups, so property owners, professionals, petty bourgeoisie, and the working class. So he kind of developed those ideas and accounted for the differences within the different social class groups. And he referred to this idea of life chances. So depending on what social class group you were in, there were also implications for how successful you would be in education, your health, that kind of thing. He uses the concept social closure. So this is the idea that those in the most powerful positions, those at the top of the hierarchy, could maintain a sense of power and privacy and sort of keep other people out of their group so it could retain its exclusivity. So one example could be like, to get onto a medicine course at university, you need to have done lots of experience, and to do work experience in a hospital, you need that social capital, you need those contacts. So that's one way that they kind of, the elite in society kind of keep their social class group as exclusive as possible. So yeah, similar to Marx, he agrees with economic position, but he also believes that it's not just the job, wealth, so things like investments, status, so the prestige attached to a person and the power, the influence that they have. And that just because you have one of those things doesn't mean you have all of those things. So some jobs are quite high status, so like firefighters, but they aren't necessarily well paid. Some people have lots of power in society and influence, but their job might be seen in quite a negative way, so something like the police. Also, we have this idea of status groups or status parties. So these are people that have things in common and have like a certain common goal, but it's not necessarily to do with their same social class group. So one example could be British Muslims, you could say working mothers, that kind of thing. So it's something that puts all people from that group together, they have a common goal, but it's not necessarily that they're from the same social class group. So the idea people can protest together and can use collective action to achieve a goal that's not necessarily based on social class. So also you could say something like the Black Lives Matter movement would be an example of a group with a common goal trying to kind of improve their status in society, taking collective action, but obviously it's not to do with the social class, it's not to do with their economic position. Okay, life chances and power relationships. So life chances are the kind of opportunities that someone has and the kind of outcomes that they are likely to achieve. So this can be to do with their job, health, education, involvement in crime, politics, poverty, etc. And then power relationships are people in society who have the most influence and those who are kind of subject to being influenced. So social class and life chances. So obviously you can use the theoretical points here: Marxism, Weberianism, functionalism, social mobility, etc. And then the three kind of main areas. So you can say education, working class pupils less likely to go to university, gain qualifications. Obviously, you can refer to lots of different things. So material deprivation, cultural deprivation, teacher labelling, all those kind of things in a paragraph like that. Health, so the middle class live 5 years longer, more likely to live a healthier lifestyle, can afford private healthcare, whereas the working class are disadvantaged in lots of ways to do with their health. Political power, so obviously most MPs go to university, and a significant number went to Oxford and Cambridge, showing the kind of power that group has. This idea of social closure is very relevant there. There is this exclusive kind of old boys network that are literally running our country. And then an against here would be social class doesn't affect life chances anymore. Social mobility is possible, and you can refer to meritocracy and role allocation. And bourgeoisement. So this is the idea that class has become less significant in impacting our life chances, and the working class are behaving more like the middle class. One example of embourgeoisement is class de-alignment. So the idea that traditionally working class people voted for the Labour Party and the middle class voted for the Conservative Party, whereas now people from working class backgrounds have started to vote for Conservatives, and people with degrees, so middle class, are actually becoming increasingly more likely to vote for Labour. So this idea of class alignment is the traditional way. Class de-alignment is that there's no longer a pattern. So the working class aren't voting for Labour anymore. The middle class aren't necessarily voting for Conservative anymore. Other reasons that class doesn't affect life chances. Actually, let's just read that. So postmodernists believe that class doesn't affect life chances anymore, because we live in a classless society. We can choose our own identity. We live in a consumer culture, so we can use credit cards and loans to buy what we want. We're not restricted by our social class. Also, government policies have helped support those from a working class background. So student top-up fees, which are basically student loans, so you don't pay till university until you've left. Policies like pupil premium, so you get additional funding if you are from a working class background. So basically levelling out the situation, making it more accessible for all social class groups to go to university, so therefore being working class won't impact your life chances. And bourgeoisement. So we'll not spend too long on this because it's horrendous, but essentially Goldthorpe and Lockwood wanted to test whether embourgeoisement was happening. So this idea that the working class were becoming more similar to the middle class in terms of their attitudes and their values. And Goldthorpe and Lockwood thought that they weren't necessarily middle class, but there was a new working class that existed. So he thought that they were more geographically mobile, so they were moving, which is something that's traditionally associated with middle class. However, they weren't moving for their job. They were moving for a better lifestyle and cheaper house prices, so therefore it's not quite the same as the middle class. And he argued that the family was becoming more privatised, so the idea that they were spending more time at home, men were spending more of their leisure time with their family. So that also indicated they were becoming slightly more towards the middle class. But they still maintain this instrumental attitude to work. So the idea that they only went to work because they needed it for money, rather than the more middle class attitude, which would be the job's kind of part of your identity, part of who you are, something you really enjoy. So we're not fully. So Goldthorpe and Lockwood essentially concluded that there wasn't a full shift from working class becoming middle class, but there was a new working class. But then Fiona Devine did some research, and she basically argued that actually there really isn't even a new working class, and bourgeoisement has not happened. So she did structured interviews, so they collect quantitative data. They're reliable because you can repeat and compare them, and she could look at the different answers and compare the findings between the different participants, and look for kind of patterns and trends in her findings to see whether this privatised instrumentalism had happened. So she didn't find evidence to support it. She found that the working class people were not particularly home-centred or privatised as Goldthorpe and Lockwood had claimed, so they were spending more time within the community still. She rejected the idea of a new working class. She also found that they still had the same sort of traditional working class values. The only reason they weren't voting for the Labour Party is because they didn't really have faith in the actual leaders of the Labour Party at that time. So it's not that their values had changed, it's just that they didn't kind of agree that the Labour Party were able to deliver on creating a more equal society. So they would have still voted for Labour and the initial aims of what the Labour Party stood for. But that is what had changed rather than the people. So essentially, if bourgeoisement comes up, you need to say it's functionalist. You need to say that it's the idea that the working class have become more like the middle class in terms of their values. Examples could be that they'd be more likely to vote for the Conservative Party, they'd be more likely to move for work. However, Devine's research, structured interviews, quantitative data that allowed her to find patterns and trends. She disproved that bourgeoisement was happening. She thought that there may be a bit more sense of being privatised, but most of the time they were still spending time in the community. And the only reason they weren't voting for the Labour Party is because they thought the Labour Party was failing to achieve the aims they wanted. And although they were moving house, the only reason they were moving house was for the lifestyle, not the job. So essentially that's not a middle class thing to do. And then class and power relationships, basically you can refer to things from Marxism, so the bourgeoisie socialising those from the working class backgrounds into the ideology of the bourgeoisie, things like social closure, that kind of thing. So the idea that they maintain power by keeping their position in society and keeping others out of their position. Gender and life chances. So Wolby is the main person you would want to talk about here. So Wolby is a feminist and she refers to the 6 patriarchal structures. She argues that these 6 here are the main areas where women are disadvantaged. Obviously in an essay you would just pick 3 of them. So you can talk about paid work, obviously, so you can refer to the pay gap, you can refer to the glass ceiling, sexism, sex discrimination, etc. You can refer to the family, so these things here: domestic violence, segregated conjugal roles, triple shift. The state, so laws not protecting women, so you can use this idea only 32% of MPs are female. under 6% of reported rape cases are convicted, so it's like the lowest conviction rate of any crime. You've got male violence towards women, so 25% experience domestic violence. And then you've got double standards, you've got the media, different kind of gender socialisation, etc. But also we've got the idea that men are disadvantaged in our society. So education, 9% gap between attainment levels. You can refer to things like lack of male role models in school, teacher labelling, feminisation of education. You've got crime, so 96% of the prison population are male. So things like gender socialisation, status frustration, all those kind of things that would lead working class boys into crime. The workplace, men are experiencing a crisis of masculinity, so a decline in manual jobs. They don't really know what their place is anymore. They don't have the same kind of ambition that they used to because they've lost their direction and their role as their primary breadwinner. Health, you could talk about male suicide rates being significantly higher than women. That could be to do with this idea of like traditional masculinity, not feeling that they can seek help or express emotions when they need to. Things to help achieve gender equality, so you can refer to things like Equal Pay Act, Sex Discrimination Act. Obviously, we've got a shift towards joint conjugal roles in the new man. Oh, we don't have a female prime minister anymore, but we did. We've had two quite recently. Number of female MPs is increasing. You can always say, like, in the workplace as well, there's like positive discrimination, so trying to get like more men into primary school teaching, trying to get more women into leadership roles, etc. Functionalists are also one you can say in terms of gender equality. So they would argue that it is equal to have men and women in different roles because there are gender differences. And then if anything comes up in terms of power relationships between men and women, you can refer to the idea of patriarchy, alpha male, men being more dominant in the public sphere, Heidenson, like the social control of women, that they're kind of kept in the home outside the public sphere where all the decisions are made. Ethnicity and life chances. So obviously here be specific about which ethnic groups you're talking about. So in terms of unemployment, Bangladeshi and Pakistani men are the most likely to be unemployed. And you can refer to the idea of institutional racism. So when the practices of an institution or an organisation disadvantage a specific ethnic group. Black feminists talk about the concrete ceiling, so it's like the added layer to the glass ceiling, which is the combination of sexism and also racism, and that particularly affects black women. Marxists talk about the reserve army of labour, so these are employees that are the first to be fired and last to be hired. So in COVID, the idea that ethnic minorities were more quickly furloughed than the white workers were. Crime, institutional racism from the police, so black men being 8 times more likely to be stopped and searched, 4 times more likely to be in prison than white men. The education system, so obviously white working class boys are the lowest achieving in the education system, but here if you take social class out of it, then you can refer to black boys and Bangladeshi and Pakistani being more likely to underachieve in relation to white pupils if you factor in social class and gender as well, because obviously your point might need to be, depending on the question, but it might need to be an ethnic minority group that you're saying are disadvantaged. And you can refer to things like ethnocentric curriculum, majority of teachers being white, teacher labelling, language barriers, etc. Political power, so the underrepresentation of different ethnic groups, and also like racism in the system, a lack of faith maybe from ethnic minority groups due to political decisions that have been made that have disadvantaged them, or a lack of role models from other ethnic groups, meaning that they might be less likely to kind of want to go into politics. Equality, so laws, so Race Relations Act is the kind of main act that you can use. You could just refer to the Equality Act. The Crime and Disorder Act aimed to take institutional racism and racial hate crimes more seriously. You could say a shift towards decolonising the curriculum, multicultural education, etc. Functionalists obviously arrogantly argue this idea, and arrogantly and ignorantly argue that assimilation should take place. So the idea that ethnic minorities would be less likely to experience racism if they assimilated to the norms and values. So for many reasons we would criticise this, but here you would get a mark for saying this is their viewpoint, that they are arguing that assimilation is a way to prevent racism, as though it's to do with their values, and obviously blaming the victims there, but there we go. And then, yeah, you can give examples of ethnicity and power relationships, so using things like stop and search, institutional racism, offender profiling, canteen culture, etc. Age and life chances. So you can talk here about how older people and younger people are disadvantaged. So young people are more likely to be on 0-hour contracts. So the idea that they only get called into work when they're needed. So essentially this idea of a reserve army of labour again. Age discrimination due to negative stereotypes, so young people being seen as lazy, unreliable, lack of punctuality, that kind of thing, and older people stereotyped as kind of incompetent. Poverty, significantly higher if you are living on a pension, because the argument is that it's too low. And also a third of children are estimated to live in poverty, which is an outrageous amount. Political power. So most MPs, the average age is 50. So young people are becoming kind of increasingly disengaged with politics. Less likely to vote, could be due to a lack of political socialisation, so kind of not being taught about politics in school or home. Age equality, legal changes, so Age Discrimination Act, Equality Act, also policies to support the elderly living in poverty, so winter fuel allowance to support with their heating bills. Pensions obviously exist. Welfare to work schemes, so different ways of finding employment for young people who are unemployed, so not in education or training. And then age and power relationships, so there's a couple of ways you can see this. So we've got children have more power now, so the idea of pester power, the idea of children being much more likely to benefit from the cultural capital of their parents. There's a lot more schemes allowing children to have voices in school, so people voice, that kind of thing. But also there's obviously significant evidence to say that adults still have the most power. So it's called age patriarchy. When adults have power over children, they can still make obviously the majority of the decisions and control children in terms of their pocket money, their rules. They set the particularistic standards in the home, etc. Disability in life chances, so you can talk about the negative ways it can impact employment opportunities. So only half of disabled people of working age are in work. Education, so attending special schools may limit their kind of opportunities in terms of qualifications. They are nearly 3 times more likely to not have qualifications in comparison to non-disabled people. The idea of being at risk of being victims of hate crime as well. Different reasons, so negative stereotypes, labelling, the media reinforcing those labels. It can become a master status, so people define someone by their disability rather than kind of seeing all of their other qualities aside from that, or making assumptions about their capabilities just because they have a certain disability that might have, no effect on those abilities. This idea of learned helplessness, so an individual starts to believe that they are not capable of certain things because of how they've been treated, even when they are fully competent. So it's like a form of self-fulfilling prophecy. You can use learned helplessness for old people as well. Equality, so Disability Discrimination Act, adjustments to buildings, media representations are obviously improving, so much more kind of representation within the media of people with different various disabilities. Religion and life chances, so the idea of institutional racism you can refer to, or the idea that there are still kind of stereotypes and evidence of discrimination against those from different religious groups. The education system, so British Muslims are less likely to have qualifications, so that can be to do with things like ethnocentric curriculum, language barriers, possibly if they had migrated to the UK, maybe having different qualifications, that kind of thing, that aren't transferable. Crime, so Islamophobia and hate crimes based on religion as well. Religious equality, so the Equality Act, it's illegal to discriminate against somebody because of their religious beliefs. Increase in multiculturalism within the curriculum, in RE and PSHE, etc. The idea of promoting tolerance and recognising kind of respect for other cultures and religions. Sexuality and life chances, so the idea that people may feel uncomfortable talking about their sexuality in the workplace, and obviously there's statistics to support that. There might be scared of discrimination or stereotyping. Education, so bullying, also this idea of a heteronormative curriculum, so the idea that things like sex education or relationships are often taught as though the expectation in society or the norm is to be heterosexual and not being as inclusive as it should be. Hate crimes motivated by sexual orientation, and homophobia just being heard in public places. Sexual equality, so legalisation of same-sex marriage, same-sex adoption, so 2014, 2001. Okay, I'm going to leave it there and then I'm going to start a new video to do the poverty section just because this has been long.